gentlemen, we've ended one set of conferences and we start, as you said, move on to the next step and start the first process of a two-day engagement that is going to be Thursday and Friday, where the governments take center stage and talk about what they're going to be doing for transforming and sustainable mineral development. It's always a pleasure to say to people at 4:45 after 3 intensive days of talking that we're going to be here for another half an hour at the most. So I apologize, but I would also love to see just a little bit of enthusiasm in the room. Shall we try one of those, you know, how those moderators annoy you when they're like, can everybody raise their hands in the air and sort of do a clap? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but can we just put our hands together for once, just one big clap. That's all the energy that we need. 1, 2, 3. All right, we're good to go. Starting, we're going to have just 3 small welcome notes from people from the government perspective, talking about how important sustainability and mineral supply chains are. I would like to invite Mr. Felix Wörtel. He's the Ambassador for the Environment, Head of the International Affairs Division of the Federal Office for the Environment, Switzerland. Mr. Felix. Oh, this is... He is here. Sir, if you could, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to open this joint WRF UNEP session, which is organized in the context of the Global Intergovernmental Meeting on Minerals that will start tomorrow. Switzerland is very pleased to see both of those events taking place in Geneva. Geneva is a global hub for international governance. You know, many government institutions, representations, organizations, NGOs, and academics are here just a few meters away around this building. It's an ideal location for building bridges among stakeholders and strengthen synergies with respect to minerals and sustainability. As we all have heard over the last 2 days, minerals play a crucial, very critical role. They're necessary for the energy transition and the sustainable development, but we also know that their extraction and their use can cause environmental harm. Just one example that we're discussing currently that shows the importance of those minerals in the context of the global the climate COP upcoming. One of these goals is triple renewable energies by 2030. This just shows the amount of minerals that will be needed to mitigate climate change. So we have to address the 2 objectives. It is essential to respond to demand for minerals, to mitigate climate change, enable economic and infrastructure development. But we also have to make sure that we manage mineral resources in a way that don't harm the environment, that they don't contribute to biodiversity loss or the pollution crisis. We also have to make sure that we don't transfer problems from different fields to the fields of the resource mining. One figure that really impressed me very much was I have learned that we might in the next 35 years use more minerals than we have used in the total history of the humans on this planet. That's just imagine how big this challenge is how important it is. And shows how we have to rethink the way how we manage these resources. We have hundreds of initiatives, standards and principles launched in the recent years to make minerals more sustainable. Yet we know that environmental challenges are still here. We need to better understand whether the existing landscape is fit for purpose, that we have those minerals available, but also to make sure that we don't cause environmental and social harm. It is an issue of concern to all the countries, regardless of resources endowments. We are all dependent on minerals. We need the same for roads and buildings, copper for communication, lithium and cobalt for electric cars. For Switzerland too, the topic is very important. We also import most of the goods and commodities we consume. Currently, more than 70% of our environmental impacts caused by consumptions in Switzerland occur abroad. And we know environmental impacts abroad have consequences in our home countries because ecosystems are interlinked, they don't stop at the borders. The UNEA, the United Nations Environmental Assembly, the highest political decision-making body for the environment, has 2021 and its fifth session adopted a second resolution on this topic. The resolution mandated an inclusive intergovernmental process where more than 120 member states, as well as observers, work together to develop ideas to enhance sustainability of minerals along the full life cycle. Member states will take on their work tomorrow, and they try to collect all those findings in the discussion together, to bring them together, and to develop non-prescriptive proposals for the consideration at the next UNEA in 2024. It will be the opportunity of UNEA to consider those outcomes, those findings, and decide what's next. We all know it will be a long journey, it will be a burdensome journey, and we need all hands on the deck to make progress. But we also know that the potential is here to improve, to have a positive environmental and social impact, and to progress, to promote environmental governance. I thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a good session.
Thank you, Felix. A long journey, lots of hands on deck, and one pair of safe hands are from UNEP. I invite Ms. Sheila Agarwal Khan, Director, Industry and Economy Division of UNEP, to give her opening remarks.
Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to join this event that the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, together with the World Resources Forum and in collaboration with the government of Switzerland, has convened this afternoon. Our economies and our societies today cannot do without metals and minerals. Just look at the energy transition. We're seeing over 3 billion tons of minerals and metals needed for the clean energy transition, from solar and wind power technologies to battery technologies for e-mobility. The forecasted resource growth that is going to need to be to feed this energy transition is going to increase by a factor of 20 by the time we hit 2035. And as Felix said, how are we going to meet this demand for resources that is going to exponentially rise to meet the clean energy transition? Already we see some 81 countries dependent on a minerals and metals economy. 70% of the global population, many living in extreme poverty, living close to these sites where minerals are extracted. But the challenge is that we can end up with a clean energy transition and an unbelievable amount of pollution, an unbelievable amount of biodiversity loss. Today, we see 90% of global biodiversity and water stress impacts from resource extraction and processing. The International Resource Panel has also said that 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions is coming from the sector. Mine tailings waste, 13 billion tons of mine tailings waste is put somewhere, housed somewhere every year, waiting for an accident in the making because of the different standards that have been in place for how mine tailings are kept. So do we need to have a clean energy transition with all kinds of other impacts that are going to cause biodiversity and pollution? Many governments over the last set of regional meetings asked for value addition. And there is an opportunity that seems to be arising from being able to keep minerals in the economy. When minerals and metals are circulating in the economy, used in solar and wind applications, used in electric, in the batteries for electric vehicles, can the resources be extracted from it and meet the future needs that are there? And how much of this will need to be progressed by governments as they set the policy and regulatory environment to create a market for more circular minerals and metals? How can we have standards in place that governments put in place policies so that there is a set of harmonized standards across industry that ensure that pollution does not happen, that ensure that mines are closed properly without having the kind of environmental damage and resource impacts that we see today? But on the industry side, there is also its own responsibility for taking action. How do the players who say that they're responsible for clean energy applications be able to call it clean if their minerals and metals are resourced in a way that has caused biodiversity and pollution impacts? We see the finance sector, the investors, looking to seeing what does it mean for their own investment decisions. And we're seeing a growing movement towards looking at investment decisions that can be seen as sustainable. We're seeing consumers look to seeing where do they source their own consumer products from. When a consumer says they're buying an electric vehicle or using solar power to power their homes or their factories, what does it mean in terms of the overall resource footprint that a consumer is going to be aware of? At the UN Environment Assembly, governments took the decision to start a process that tomorrow and the day after land in a global intergovernmental meeting. And so the next 2 days here, we will see governments think through what does this mean for the countries that they govern? What are the kind of proposals that they want to put forward to have a sector that not only brings economic benefits, but also makes sure that the hidden costs economically are factored in, the social and the environmental costs that today might not have been factored in. We will go from here towards the UN Environment Assembly next year between February and March 2024 in Nairobi, where governments will then take their decisions and decide what are the next steps. So I'm now pleased to give you back the floor, Masuma. Thank you very much.
And our last opening remarks for this evening are from Marcina Rohan-Brossard. She's the Deputy Head International Affairs Division, the Federal Office for the Environment of Switzerland.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction. And as was mentioned by Felix and by Sheila, the journey of this minerals story by UNEP began actually in 2019. It's not so long a time ago. And I had the pleasure with Pakistan to have been nominated by the UNEA president to co-chair the regional consultation and also the global meeting that will begin tomorrow. And during this regional consultation, many of you were there somewhere in Africa, in Latin America, in in Asia, in Paris for the VEO group, or in Geneva. I think more than 70 colleagues are already in the room and will be there also tomorrow and the day after. And what we had to do during our regional consultation, we had to understand the scope. What is the problem? Where are challenges? Where are risks? What solutions are already in place? Or where do we have space for continued collaboration? And it was very interesting because 5 years ago, it was the first time we discussed it at UNEA Minerals. And now we have 120 countries who nominated national focal point to discuss environment and minerals issues. So I think the journey will continue also after the next UNEA. And this process, regional consultation, they were not only representative from a country, there were a lot of colleagues, representative from the industry, from the social society, civil society, from academia. And it was very rich discussion. Myself, my co-chair from Pakistan, Sakle, we learned a lot. And I'm sure also what we heard from the colleagues, they also had a peer review among them, peer learning. So it was a very interesting process. And we learn about challenges, about needs in this transparent process. Now you can imagine what is the result. Now we have first result, we have 24 proposals, so ideas how to continue on some issues. I just want to mention a few. We have challenges on sound. For example, we had many discussions during these 3 days at the World Resource Forum also on this issue. We discussed challenging on tailing management, mine closure, the whole life of the mine. We discuss also small-scale mining, the informal sector in general. And we also express needs. We know there is a multitude of instruments, of initiative. Is that enough? Are they effective enough? And perhaps there is a need for an assessment to have a look at all this initiative. And we also discuss also circular economy, life cycle, the whole life of the product. And there you have also trade issues, as you mentioned, Sheila. Also the financing sector can play a very important role. And at the end, we discuss international cooperation. And we see that there is a lot of actors, there is a lot of instrument already, and we have not to reinvent the wheel, as we say, but we have to build on what exists already. And I think during the next 2 days, we will discuss, we will redefine a little bit perhaps this proposal. And at the end, the outcome will be a co-chair summary where we will pass back, give ideas to member states what they want perhaps to discuss, to negotiate at the next UNEA. So thank you very much for this very nice time I had as a co-chair to co-facilitate all this process. It was very inspiring, very nice, and I'm very keen to co-chair the next 2 days. Thank you to all of you, and see you tomorrow. But before tonight, we will have a very nice reception with music. And I know World Resource Forum do not only gather people for exchange of ideas, but also for dancing. So you should stay for the panel, and after we will have reception and dance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So basically, we're staying here for the alcohol and the music, and we're just going to have a panel discussion in between. I am happy and absolutely delighted. About 15 years ago, when you used to have panels around mining, it was normally in much smaller spaces, and you just had geologists and mining engineers telling you horrible stories around exploration, a lot of fun stories. We've moved on from that time, and now we've got a panel which is about as diverse as it could get. Can I please invite Gabriela Inciana? She's Head of Sustainable Development from Santiago, Chile. Teodorico Sandoval, he's Chief of Policy Planning and International Affairs Division from the Government of Philippines. Khadija Drame, Deputy Coordinator of Legal Affairs Unit at the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development from Senegal. Aidan Davey, Chief Operating Officer for the ICMM. Inga Peterson, Executive Director, Global Battery Alliance. Zenze Awesi, she is the Vice President of the Association of Women in Mining Africa, and Professor Paul Eakins, who's a professor at the UCL in the UK. Could you put a big hand together for our panelists? And if you could join me on stage, that would be great. So as our panelists are coming online, one of the things that we decided to do with this panel is say, you know, that title slide, it's really great. We all like transformation, we all want changes and enhancing sustainability, assuming that sustainability is already there, we just need to enhance it in some way. But one of the things that we decided to do with this panel is stop talking about the challenges. We said, let's get on with it. What do we actually need to do? And with this lovely panel where we have a mix of industry, government, academics, and think tank, that's exactly what we're going to try and attempt today, to understand what is good practice, get examples of it, and how do we move on from there? How do we move on from the smaller conversations we're having around value chains and move to actionable research? And what is the role of government in that? Excellent. Since our panel is already seated and in no particular order, Zenze, just because you seem to be sitting right next to me, the question that I sort of put to the panel was, what is driving the change? We know there's a lot of stuff that is driving this change, but compared to 10 years ago, when you open your inbox, what is the main thing that is coming up, sticking out in your inbox saying, here is the reason I need you to do these things?
I think it's desire. It's desire. And I don't even need to open my inbox to see that. As I was walking up to the center, it's just seeing the amount of, EVs, all the cars and going into a restaurant and seeing people with an electric cigarette, for example, then it makes you realize this is why we are having this kind of discussions. So I'll stop it at that.
Gabriella, compared to years ago, what's driving your Chile's need for sustainable mining practices right now?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a climate crisis. It's a very important driver. We have a very important crisis on water availability. And also we have a great pressure from communities. I think it's going to be bigger, and we have like a confidence crisis. So it's waters, it's something material, and it's confidence. So we have to evolve to that, and we have to change because of that.
Aiden, ICMM, what's driving your members to be better?
So I think it's a number of factors, and it's somewhat is dependent upon the performance area that we're focused on. So if I take an example of a specific initiative that we've been very deeply involved in, along with UNEP and the Principles for Responsible Investment on developing a global industry standard on tailings management, there the driver was tragedy. And that was a response to the tragic collapse of the Brumadinho tailings dam in Brazil back at the beginning of 2019, which acted as a real wake-up call to an industry that largely felt it had these issues under control, and demonstrably that was not necessarily the case. So in that instance, tragedy is driving it. And that is an initiative that involved deep collaboration to zero in a really specific performance area. If I think of some of the other work that we're very involved in at the moment, so for example, we're currently working with 3 other responsible mining standard owners to try and see, can we consolidate and collapse the very good work we've done over a number of decades to try and come up with a single standard based upon what we've done to date, enriched by multi-stakeholder perspectives. And the driver for that is partly around simplifying what has become an incredibly complicated standards landscape in terms of responsible mining standards. And the other driver is, how do you affect change through uptake and implementation of a really robust responsible mining standard at scale? And that remains an ongoing challenge. So I think it kind of depends on the initiative that's underway, and the drivers kind of link back to that. But beyond those 2 motivations, in terms of that broader focus on responsible mining standards, and we'll come back to this, clearly the growing awareness amongst governments around the world of the importance of minerals to the transition towards a low carbon future, and indeed the concerns around shortages of supply around critical minerals, that's also a critical driver of change in this area.
Okay, Inge. Because the Global Battery Alliance is kind of, it sits in a lovely place because you get to decide on environmental standards before the battery markets truly take on, which is something that some of the other industries do not have. Or have I put too much onto your industry there? But when the Alliance came together, what was the primary thing that was driving the industry towards saying we need to get this environmental thing sorted?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. And this dovetails nicely also with Aidan's remarks, but the Global Battery Alliance was created not just by industry stakeholders, but by participants from the broader battery ecosystem, including civil society organizations, public sector organizations, academia, coming together with corporate members of the entire battery value chain, from miners to cell makers, auto makers, all the way to recyclers, really based on a double or twin realization that batteries are going to be essential for the green transition to electrify both the transport and the power sector, that the growth is going to be tremendous. And we had in our initial vision forecast growth numbers that have since been outpaced by a factor of 5. We're looking at year-on-year growth of about 30% between now and 2030, and the relevant demand on primary resources to feed those supply chain demands. But also that there's significant sustainability impacts associated with these value chains, and not just upstream, but throughout the value chain. For the members of the Global Battery Alliance, there were a couple of priority issues. One being the issue of child labor associated typically with cobalt value chains or artisanal cobalt value chains, but not only in that segment. And the other one being the battery carbon footprint. So really it was a growing awareness of civil society, but also of the participants in that value chain, that there is a collective responsibility for those impacts, that they cannot be borne by a single stakeholder group alone in that value chain. And also that the burden of proof is on the value chain to show the full sustainability and ESG impact of that product, and show that it is the net sustainability impact results in better outcomes of battery electric vehicles than ICEs, internal combustion engines. Because ultimately this issue is becoming more and more politicized. So we need facts, we need transparency about these impacts, and we need really a holistic definition of what good sustainability performance actually means for this emerging industry.
Excellent. Teodorico, Philippines, what is driving the emphasis on environmental standards and responsible mining in your country and region?
The challenges actually, and the driving challenge in the, of course, is to strike the balance between the, of course, the utilizations of the natural resources and the environment. And one of the challenges on this is the, of course, the changing policies that, of course, affected both the, of course, the investors and the government. And, of course, the, for example, on the current demand on the green metals, of course, one of the important challenges that has to be anticipated by the developed countries with respect to the developing countries, with some developing countries with having ample critical minerals, is to, of course, to evaluate the necessary trade-offs that is needed with respect to, of course, to the, for example, the value adding that is much needed by the developing countries, wherein, of course, like, for example, the provisions of the processing plant. And from this, of course, trade-offs, of course, it's come with the programs, of course, and always been part of the program is the, of course, the environmental protection, as well as the, of course, the well-being of the communities or neighboring communities in the mining sector.
Okay. Professor Eakins, because you sort of, I'm assuming in your research, get to see drivers coming in from different sides and different environment, social governance. What do you see as the most prominent priority for governments particularly, which is driving them towards more environmental safe practices in the mineral sector?
Well, thanks, Marumi. And I mean, I think from my perspective, I'm here because I'm a member of the International Resource Panel. And I was asked to be the lead coordinating author of a big assessment report, which has now just gone out for external peer review on financing the supply of minerals and metals for sustainable development. And I think the main driving force for that was the twin recognition that this step change in minerals and metals of a certain kind are going to be required for the energy transition globally. And we've heard plenty of numbers about that. And the recognition that those minerals and metals would not be forthcoming if they did not systematically contribute to the sustainable development of the countries and communities in which the mines were located. And too often that is not the case. And the evidence that we've gathered from this report makes that very clear. There will need to be a transformation in mining, an economic, social, environmental, and governance transformation in mining. And the task of the report has been to find out how might that come about. And in one sense, it's clear that if current best practice in the mining sector was universalized, that transformation would have been achieved. And to get evidence for that, you only have to read the most recent Responsible Mining Index from the Responsible Mining Foundation, which has been at this World Resources Forum over the last few days. The question then is, how are we going to universalize that best practice? And we focus particularly on the finance sector, because the finance sector has a really important role in demanding that best practice from the companies whom they finance. We've also obviously looked at the companies, and it's clear that many of the companies want to do the right thing. Many of them are doing some of the right things, but they are constrained by this mishmash of reporting standards that Aidan was talking about. So it's very difficult to get the information to the investors in a form that they can understand it. And then we have the role of government, which is what you asked me for. And what's become very clear in the report is that firstly, government will have to mandate some of these reporting standards so that we get a comparable level of information across the sector. But secondly, governments will have to be prepared to decommodify this industry because there are cost implications. And unless governments and importing countries are prepared to pay the costs of responsible mining, then the companies that want to do it will be driven by competitive pressures not to be able to do it. So governments are going to have to change the terms of trade. And two of the most fascinating sessions I've been attending over the last few days is about the EU Critical Materials Act, which is trying to come forward with the idea of mutually beneficial partnerships between importing countries, exporting countries, companies, and local communities to arrive at the arrangements that will make responsible mining possible. And that's what we're trying to articulate. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, what are the ideas that are driving the environmental standards or the importance of environmental standards in Senegal, especially from a legal perspective?
Qui va faire la traduction?
Emmanuel, do we have somebody translating?
Pour reprendre la question, s'il vous plaît.
Repeat the question. What is driving the environmental drive and sustainability standards in Senegal, particularly from a Ministry of Law and
Qu'est-ce qui est le principal moteur de changement des standards au Sénégal?
Merci beaucoup. Je voudrais tout d'abord vous remercier pour l'invitation. Et je pense que le Sénégal est un pays qui regorge de ressources minières et je pense qu'il fallait à un moment faire un peu
la jonction entre l'exploitation de ces ressources minières, le développement économique et également le bien-être des communautés. Et je pense qu'au Sénégal, nous avons mis le focus sur le cadre juridique. Le cadre juridique, en exigeant pour tous les projets de développement, y compris les projets miniers, ce qu'on appelle l'évaluation environnementale. Et depuis notre code de 2001, cette évaluation a été une exigence. Et le code minier également a suivi en réaffirmant l'exigence de cette évaluation environnementale pour toutes les sociétés minières. Et il faut dire que depuis 2001, on a noté un réel changement compte tenu du fait que les exigences qui sont prévues aussi bien dans le code de l'environnement que dans le code minier en matière de préservation de l'environnement pour le secteur minier ont été suivies.
So Ms. Dramé thanked for the invitation and mentioned that Senegal is rich in mineral resources, and it was important to make the link among or create synergies among the communities exploiting the resources and sustainable management of such resources. She mentioned that regulations have played an important role in environmental sustainability, and with the reform of the environmental code in 2001, the environmental impact study became a requirement for all projects, including mining projects. Since then, real changes have been observed in Senegal.
Et également, à côté de cette évaluation environnementale qui est une exigence du Code de l'environnement et du Code minier, on a mis en place un dispositif de contrôle parce que si on demande à un projet ou bien à une entreprise de faire une évaluation environnementale et de disposer d'un plan de gestion environnementale, il faudra qu'il y ait un contrôle, un suivi pour voir est-ce que les engagements qui ont été pris par ces entreprises minières ont fait l'objet de respect ou pas. Et ce dispositif de contrôle est actuellement mis en place et exécuté par le ministère en charge de l'environnement en relation avec tous les acteurs qui sont concernés par l'exploitation minière.
Senegal has set up a control and monitoring mechanism for the implementation of these plans. And they have a national validation and monitoring committee made up of various stakeholders that looks at the enforcement of these plans.
Thank you. So we've heard various drivers. Some are from the national governments. What we are hearing is responsibility towards citizens, communities, water crisis, environmental impacts that are harming their communities. Then from the industry, we're hearing about the multitude of multi-stakeholder representatives that they have to address and the impacts that they're trying to address. And from Paul, we're hearing about the role of finance and how you need to bring these guys in. Let me start with you, Inga, on the second set of questions here, because as a value chain, particularly at multiple actors and multiple stakeholders, decision-making requires information. And we were having this conversation and we've had so many panels here about getting the right information to be able to actually make informed decisions. And this is something that the Battery Alliance has been looking at. Can you talk us through some of the positives of trying to get this information together and some of the challenges, particularly when governments may want different information, investors may want different information, and the industry itself needs different information? This challenge of getting data together and what has been the positive towards creating this data knowledge for making decisions?
Lots of dimensions in your question. I'll try to keep it brief. I think this could fill its own panel in multitudes in that question. So the GBA members, and now there are about 150 of them, have set out to achieve this triple objective of scaling sustainable, circular, and responsible battery value chains by 2030. In order to operationalize that vision, we've devised a transparency and accountability framework that's called the Battery Passport, which is essentially a digital product passport at the battery level that records reporting on three different dimensions. One, being the tracking and tracing of the material flows. So showing where does the material come from, the cobalt, the lithium, the nickel, how does it flow through the value chain. 2 being the technical parameters of the battery, and 3 being key sustainability performance expectations that take into account existing standards, existing regulatory requirements, but that really go beyond that in defining, based on a holistic definition of a sustainable battery, what are the key performance expectations for all participants in that value chain. So we try to elaborate these performance expectations in multi-stakeholder working groups to really have consistent reporting and comparability of the product so that consumers can ultimately base purchasing decisions on that. And even in terms of B2B procurement, to base purchasing decisions on that harmonized information. So, for example, if we're looking at the battery carbon footprint, the rules on how to calculate this battery carbon footprint, the actual greenhouse gas emissions during the production process from mineral extraction until it is placed in the vehicle, that may need to be presented differently to different regulators in different countries, but the rules on how to calculate it should ideally be the same. So we're trying to provide that space with our multi-stakeholder forum to actually come to a consensus on how you may want to collect that data, how it should be verified, and how it should ultimately be presented to the end consumer in a way that is actionable and understandable and comparable. So this is how we're addressing this question very specifically, and we'll be advancing to other dimensions of key sustainability performance expectations, including, of course, biodiversity, water management, etc. We've identified a long list, actually, of 25 issues and impacts that are commonly associated with battery value chains.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll stop there.
I sort of want to take this to you, Gabriella, in a sense of the voluntary standards side of the industry has been trying to come up with indicators, whether it's environmental, social governance, but I have never seen those indicators sort of be the same indicators that governments look at. So when the environmental impact assessment is done, what the EIA requires may be very different from what, for example, the battery passport may require. Are governments now thinking on capitalizing on what voluntary standards are being asked to produce? Or do you think there are still parallel streams because the government's need for information is very different from the consumer's need for information?
Thank you for your question. We are very interested in transparency of information. We think that it's very, very important to recover that confidence that I told you, because information makes the people equal. So we are working very hard on this access to justice, to information, and we think very strongly that if everyone has access to that information, everyone is going to be more confident, and industry is going to be to have a better performance. So this is now a government commitment. We are joining the EITI initiative, so we are working very seriously on that. And we have many scales on mining. We have the mega producers. We are the biggest copper production in the world. We also have artisanal producers. So we have to be there with everyone, not only with the bigger ones. So we have to work with the smaller and the medium and the large, okay?
Zenzi, you've also been working on a research project that has looked at about 10 African countries, looking at ESG practices and impacts within these 10 countries. How's the data exercise going?
So is it collecting the data or, yeah. So many times when we went around, getting this data was a little bit tricky because I think we spoke yesterday about trust as well. Everybody wanted to know why we want to collect this data. So which then comes to the point of, it gets very important to explain to the ones that we're getting data from why we take it, because we are a firm believer in education through advocacy. So the data collection was tricky at first, but we managed to get, so basically it was about collecting data on the ESG component, but looking at the regulatory framework of the countries that we visited.
Okay, so let's have a conversation with Zenze when she's not on record. She's got a very interesting couple of stories to tell about how governments have reacted when being asked for information on environmental impacts. Those stories are best discussed over beer and not in the presence of a microphone. I hope I haven't gotten into trouble anymore. Eden, let me come to you, because when the ICMM started, the ICM used to have a scoreboard, and then the ICMM moved towards guidelines and toolkits, just encouraging people, this is how you do things. And between your members from BHP to Antofagasta, for example, how you're reporting on environmental impacts and social impacts has now become to change, because each company is kind of doing its own thing. So I have two questions for you. In terms of driving environmental change, is that diversification important? Because BHP is dealing with a different set of countries, Antofagasta is dealing with a different context, therefore pushing everybody to the same reporting standard did or did not make sense. And second, where do the governments come in? At what point does this stop becoming an ICMM member requirement? And I'd sort of say, right, this now needs to be part of the environmental legislation for each country, and the governments need to take on. Can you tell us about the thinking behind those two ideas?
Yeah, so really good question. And just to maybe correct something in the question, and that is that we did start off very early on when the organization was first came into being 20 years ago. At that stage, there was a generalized commitment to report on progress against what was then the 10 principles, which were the membership requirements back in the day. But over time, and in fairly rapid short order, in about 2007, the commitment we made as a membership is that all members would report to the Global Reporting Initiative Sustainability Reporting Guidelines, as it was today, the Sustainability Reporting Standards. So there is a universal framework there that is in use and that has been adopted across the membership. But I guess, a couple of things have happened in the intervening period that I think are incredibly important. Firstly, there's a whole question around the value proposition that comes from aggregate corporate sustainability reporting versus asset-based reporting. Secondly, there's been a multiplicity of different reporting initiatives have emerged in the intervening period, and some of those have disappeared. So what we've seen is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board in the US, the International Integrated Reporting Committee. These all were developing parallel approaches to reporting on sustainability performance across multiple sectors. As I think is not uncommon, we're now starting to see, from that sort of the thousand flowers blooming approach, we're now starting to see a consolidation or a convergence within the reporting space as well. So the International Sustainability Standards Board has essentially taken out 3 or 4 of the reporting initiatives such as SASB, the IIRC, the CDSB, and 1 or 2 others to be determined. But I think we're in a 3 poles currently. There is GRI with its emphasis on double materiality, and we won't go into what that means at this stage. There is the ISSB, which has and that's the International Sustainability Standards Board, which has more or less a singular focus on what is material from a financial standpoint. And then we have regional initiatives, and probably preeminent amongst those is the European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Initiative and the work that's being driven forward by the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. So again, I think all that is to say that there has been both a degree of simplification, a degree of consolidation, a degree of alignment in what good looks like from a reporting standpoint at the global level, at the corporate level at least. But that still leaves open the question of what is happening at an asset level. And I think there is an unresolved debate around how meaningful is asset by asset level data, and is it more meaningful and more valuable to have asset by asset data that speaks to the quality of management of an individual company? And I think if you marry asset by asset level disclosures around quality of management with corporate level reporting against whatever framework is preferred, that gives you a very, very good line of sight over a company's practices and reporting. And so certainly the work that we have done through our membership requirements, the ICMM mining principles, is to give really clear line of sight on an asset by asset basis to how companies are performing against, in our case, a range of something like 38 performance expectations. Now, again, I think one of the complexities that I mentioned earlier is we've got our standard. There are other standards out there, but as we hopefully move towards what we've seen in the in the non-financial reporting space of a degree of consolidation, simplification, I think we'll see the same thing with responsible mining standards. But there, I would really encourage people to think in terms of the value proposition that comes from responsible mining standards that gives you insight into quality of management and the degree to which things have been responsibly produced versus corporate level reporting that gives you insight into the contribution of companies across a whole field of different reporting metrics.
I'm going to throw this back at you in the sense of lowest common denominator when it comes to environmental reporting, because you guys understand the industry, you know what mining companies at the asset level. How much of this would you like to see in environmental regulations and laws, in national regulations and laws? Or do you think it is best left in a space where it can adapt quickly to changing demands? Because laws take time to change.
Yeah, look, it's a great question. And I think whether we're talking about reporting or whether we're talking about what responsible mining practices look like, there's a really powerful role for regulation. And we're seeing that starting to come through, and it's been kind of fascinating. Paul mentioned the European
Critical
Minerals Raw Materials Act. Thank you. It's a little bit of a mouthful. But bound up in that, there is both the emergence of an obligate requirement to report and an obligate requirement also to certify to a recognized form of responsible mining standard. Now, that's the kind of thing that we're seeing come through, not just in the European regulation. There are elements of that in the regulatory developments that are coming through in the US, in Canada, in Australia, and in other geographies as well. So I do think we're moving to a situation where we are seeing greater impetus from governments to drive corporate actors who might otherwise choose not to do this, to be required to do this. And I think that's a really positive development. I think the other thing, though, that I would really call on governments perhaps to do is to look much, much more closely at the point of production. So we're seeing a lot of activity currently driven by the point of procurement for the most part, to a degree the point of production, because of course Critical Raw Materials Act extends to domestic production in the EU as well as sourcing internationally. But for the most part, I am still mystified by the fact that many host governments, when it comes to the issuing of contracts and licenses to mining operators, they still don't have really basic protections in place to say you cannot be awarded a contract or a license if you don't have a solid commitment to responsible mining practices, if you don't have the capacity to deliver on that commitment, and if you're not subscribing to a recognized responsible mining standard that will help others to hold you account to this. I think it's a really simple and basic ask, but as I say, I'm mystified that most host governments still haven't seen fit to do that.
Let's talk to your Dreco on that. As you have Philippines copper, nickel, gold, you have some international mining companies, but there are a lot of joint ventures and there are a number of Philippine operators in country. What as a government, as being responsible for environmental impacts, what is your main objective? Saying my environmental regulation has to protect the environmental, keep the balance. And do you care about all of these international standards that everybody keeps talking about? Is your job a lot more straightforward than all of this? Oh, we must have an international standard and we must have data and we must have all of this. Where do you stand on that?
In the Philippines, actually, we have one of the sound mining law, it is of course, there are two mining laws in the Philippines. This is for the large scale is the Republic Act 7942, and then for the small scale is the Republic Act 7076. Both of these are, of course, both of these law addresses all the needed balance between, of course, the needed extractions of mineral resources with the environmental protections and the social the social licenses. For example, on each stage of the mining, from exploration to development to utilization and the processing, there is an equivalent program. For example, on environmental protection, the company is required to submit a 5 years environmental protection program, and then every 2 years they have to submit or every year they have to submit the annual environmental protection program, and similar with the of course with the social development 5-year social development program and annual social development program, and of course this is also applicable to the even to the processing plant, and the participation, of course, when making this program is really important, no? And that's why the host and neighboring communities, even the NGO, the non-governmental organizations are being involved on this program. So it's really important for the government, of course, to implement the sound policy. And actually, we at present we don't have much problem with the large scale operation because it is already established. Our challenges actually is the on the small scale mining because of the of course we call this the informal, of course, the informal miners, no? So this is what we have to continuously address because, for example, out of at present there are just 55 cooperative or associations that are formally, of course, compliance with the law, and there are thousands of small-scale miners. So even the small-scale mining, there is a what I've said, an equivalent program. No, of course, not as big as the large scale. For example, we have the instead of social development program, we have the community development plan for the small-scale miners, and then of course the even to address the environmental protections. Of course, they are being required a much simplified compliance. So actually, these are integrated on these two mining laws. But right now, and maybe lastly, one of the challenges that always, of course, been on the side of the both the mining companies and to the government is the, of course, the changing fiscal regime, yeah, which of course there are, of course, one of the challenges is whenever there's a changes on the fiscal regime, of course, both the mining companies and even the government, some get gain on this, and some are from the private sector. They are hesitant, of course, for the investors to, of course, to come in. But with respect in general to the balancing between mining and environment, actually we continuously improve it. For example, and finally, we made a one of the direction with respect to the database, which is really important, is the establishment of geospatial database. So the geospatial database, of course, are a multi. Actually, it is a multi-resources. Like for example, on that, if you will see a simpler map of the whole Philippine Islands, you can, using the geospatial database, in particular to the not our target first is for the government on the decision making. And of course, it is also of help and beneficial to the investor and to the private sector. For example, you can identify there what are the areas that are close to mining.
Yeah.
Like, for example, these are a protected watershed. This is a biodiversity area. But of course, on that geospatial, you can identify also the determined mineral reservation area and those areas that are open both to, of course, to large scale and open scale mining, small scale mining. So you can see if there is some overlap.
Yeah.
So that's really important. So I think that is how important, of course, I said to strike the balance between the, of course, the structures of minerals and, of course, the taking care of the environment as well as, of course, the needed balance with respect to the sound need of the community within the mining area.
No, thank you. And if anybody has seen some of the newer mining cadastre systems, just the amount of information that you can get on a country in license areas, communities, biodiversity, some of the ones that I've seen from Latin America and Africa are more impressive than the ones I've seen for the USA. So, you know, it says something. Paul, let me come to you next, because the report says something very important. Of course, you need to have the financial sector in. The question is how? Because one of the issues that was debated, and the EU made great strides in this, was actually to issue a green taxonomy. So when somebody said, I am green, they had to fit certain parameters. And that was supposed to help the financial sector evaluate what was green. There are lots of numbers on the assets under management, under green financing, have increased tremendously over the last 10 years. But the overall, if you look at total number of assets, where portfolio managers are looking at green, that majority is still not taking sustainability. In the US, we actually have moves where the governments of certain states are saying, you cannot include sustainability as a reason for making pension fund investment decisions. So, you know, so there's the naysayers in that as well. In the work that you've looked at under the IRP, are there concrete steps apart from moral persuasion or investor activism? How do we get the financial money, the debt people, the equity people, the loan people? What is the step apart from saying, guys, you need to do this because it's important? How are we getting them on board on funding sustainable investments in mineral supply chains?
Well, I think one has to start with the people who are looking for those opportunities. You mentioned the taxonomy, for example. The taxonomies have been very, very slow in recognizing that mining is an absolutely essential activity. So that even if you look at the European Union taxonomy, that they haven't yet agreed the conditions of what responsible mining will be. So mining isn't there. So those investors who are guiding their investments according to the European taxonomy, which is what they're supposed to be doing, they don't consider mining. And in many of the so-called responsible investment funds, mining is categorized with tobacco, weapons, and alcohol as things that people don't want to invest in. So there's a real image problem. Part of that is justified because, you know, mining hasn't always been terribly positive. But as Aidan has said, it's changed. It wants to change, but unless it can get access to adequate capital, it won't. There is a strong movement, and in this report, we've tried to map all the various dimensions of what you call the sustainable finance sector, and it's not trivial. There is an appetite there. I mean, obviously, there are the guys who only want to make money. Obviously, I mean, we know that exists. And Aidan's point about the need for some regulation is going to be important because it's important that they are not allowed to make money out of screwing up communities or the environment. So it's very important that they won't be allowed to do that. At the same time, there are significant sums of money that is actually looking for good investments in both the moral sense and also the risk management sense. Because this TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the Nature Financial Disclosure, these are risk management. These are risk management tools, because it is recognized increasingly in the financial sector that bad practice with regard to climate or nature will come back to bite you, either reputationally or in terms of the actual value of the asset that you have. So I think what we have to do is we have to pull on every conceivable lever, from the taxonomies through to the sustainable finance people, through to the regulations, so that the money really does flow in the required quantities to the kind of mining that we want to see, and which many parts of the mining sector actually want to do. They want to do that kind of mining, but unless they're paid adequately for their product, so that there is a difference between green copper and brown copper, for example, they can't afford to do that, and the financiers won't come in unless they perceive that this is going to be a profitable activity. So you've got to push and pull on every part of this system.
My next question is for Khadija. My question is, from a legal and regulatory point of view, sometimes when environmental standards are not strong enough in a country's legislation, it causes problems. From her experience, is it more important to have environmental legislation that can actually be implemented, or excellent legislation which is difficult to implement in certain countries?
D'un point de vue légal, juridique et réglementaire, il arrive que les normes environnementales ne soient pas assez strictes. Cela pose des problèmes. Alors, d'après votre expérience, est-il plus important de disposer d'une législation environnementale rigoureuse et difficile à implémenter, ou d'avoir quelque chose de plus souple mais plus facile à implémenter?
Merci beaucoup. Comme j'ai eu à le rappeler, la législation joue un rôle extrêmement important dans la durabilité environnementale du secteur minier. Et dans cette législation, il faut dire que tout n'est pas rose, parce que il y a des contraintes dans la mise en œuvre, même si beaucoup d'entreprises minières quand même se sont conformées à cette législation. Il faut noter qu'il y a des gaps, il y a des lacunes également, parce que quand je prends l'exemple de la gestion des résidus miniers, ça pose problème, parce qu'on n'a pas une réglementation qui est spécifique à la réglementation de ces résidus miniers, même si dans le Code de l'environnement, on impose aux entreprises minières de faire une étude d'impact environnemental, de se conformer aux autres lois sur l'environnement. Je prends l'exemple également de la réhabilitation des sites miniers qui pose extrêmement problème, même si dans la législation, on a des dispositions quand même qui font de la réhabilitation une exigence. Et on est allé plus loin même dans notre cadre juridique en imposant aux entreprises minières de déposer une garantie pour qu'à la fin de l'exploitation, qu'il y ait une réhabilitation. Mais dans la pratique, on s'est rendu compte que ça pose problème, parce que c'est un texte qui date de 2009 et que ce n'est que l'année dernière que quelques entreprises minières ont commencé à alimenter ce fonds. La législation existe, il y a des gaps. Comme autre lacune ou bien contrainte que nous avons par rapport à la mise en œuvre de ces législations, ce sont par exemple les installations de traitement. Même s'il y a une législation qui exige que les déchets ou bien les résidus soient traités, alors que dans la pratique, les installations ne sont pas, les entreprises ne sont pas assez outillées pour assurer ce traitement, ça pose problème. Et c'est pour cette raison que nous fondons un espoir sur le processus de cette de la mise en œuvre de la résolution 512 sur les mines, parce qu'à l'issue, on espère avoir des instruments quand même qui vont aider à améliorer certains points ou bien certaines difficultés qui sont rencontrées par les États, en tout cas, qui regorgent de ces ressources minières.
As it was mentioned, regulations play an important role, but there are constraints in implementing them. On the mineral residues, there are problems. It's one of the sectors where there are problems with the regulations, also with the rehabilitation of degraded sites. And also, Galida mentioned that only last year, some of the regulations started being implemented. Treatment installations also pose problem as companies are not equipped enough to address the treatments that are needed. This is why Senegal hopes that this process of the UNEP resolution, I think that this process of the UNEP resolution is important, and hopes that to get an instrument to help them addressing the difficulties that they are facing.
Thank you. So far, so what we've heard is from governments, from industry bodies, they all have different levers to pull, as Paul sort of said. Regulations is one of the strongest levers available to a government, but they need to be well designed and they need to be implementable and implemented. And the question of how do they align with the industry standards at the same point, and therefore you're looking at areas of collaboration where you can have the same reporting requirements, the same data requirements, the same codes of behavior, so that the industry doesn't struggle. Now, before I move them on to their last bit, do you want to ask them any questions? Or was everything that brilliant? All right, we're going to start here and then we'll come to the back. So, your name and just where you're from.
My name is Marcel Vester. I'm from the Netherlands. I realize it's a tricky question, but it's the end of the day, so allow me to ask that question. What about bribery? Mm-hmm. I think there are a lot of good-willing people, but there are also companies who have their self-interests and are actually quite powerful to derail these good initiatives. What are the views of the panel members on that?
Let me take one more question and then we can go around. The sir at the back.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Hassan. I'm from South Africa. I heard a lot of lamentation about the excessive voluntary reporting mechanisms. My question is, why don't we consider mandatory reporting if there's so many problems with it? Voluntary ones.
Oh, believe me, that thought has occurred to some of us as well before. Is there a third question we can put in? Yep.
Hi, thank you. My question is for Gabriela. I'm Mohit Chobe from Geneva Graduate Institute. It's about, Gabriela mentioned about confidence crisis. And if you could elaborate a bit more on how that is playing out in our country. Thank you.
Okay, so we have clarifying questions and we've got questions of, well, why aren't you mandatory doing it? Right. Shall we start, Gabriela? The first question was probably the clearest. Just wanted a little bit more. What is this crisis that you referred to?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. This is about many accidents, many environmental events with the contamination, pollution, and communities are angry with mining. Many communities think that they are not receiving enough from the mining industry and the government. And there is like a trade there with the companies and government. So it's like money. They need to see what they are structuring from the earth, and they are not seeing anything. We have some communities that don't have water, they don't have drinking water, but they are seeing buses and trucks every day and every hour. So this is the imbalance that is causing this confidence crisis. It's our point of view. So we are working very hard on transparency, but also in communication. We have some tools to receive information and give information to the public, but we are working very hard on that. We recently signed the Escazú agreement to be better on that and improve this access to information and also justice, environmental justice.
Thank you.
I'm going to direct the next question at you, Inga, because as the battery producer, you are dealing with multiple supply chains, multiple minerals, a whole host of suppliers. Have you considered this question of voluntary versus mandatory, which is an old debate, but importantly, the question I'm asking is, are you looking at processes or impacts? Because that's also been a debate within the responsible practices thing, is we won't prescribe practice. Here's the impact we want you to have. We don't care how you get to it. Mm-hmm. Have you had that debate within the Alliance?
To some extent, yes. I think it's a really interesting and valid question. Sometimes when we're trying to create the broadest possible consensus on standardized performance expectations, we end up with the lowest common denominator. So in the view of the Global Battery Alliance, if you work with the early adopters, the sustainability champions, the pioneers in a certain industry, it allows you to raise the level of ambition and to set a new standard, but it then obviously falls to regulators, to standard setters, to make that the new norm, for the laggards to follow. So this is what we've seen, for example, with the battery carbon footprint. We've come out with the greenhouse gas rulebook before the regulators have. Now it's going to become a mandatory requirement, the battery carbon footprint declaration, which everybody else has to follow. So I think there's this reciprocal relationship between voluntary and then making it mandatory. And I think there needs to be space for both.
Eden, because again, this has been an ICMM conversation for 20 years between voluntary and mandatory. And I know sometimes they're called voluntary, but they're actually the cost of doing business. You cannot operate without following some of these standards. Has that changed in the industry's thinking anymore? Because now it seems with the majors, that's just how you do business. It's not voluntary anymore.
Look, I think that's fair. At what point does voluntary tip over into table stakes for continuing to do business? But I think the question's so interesting about if voluntary initiatives are challenging, why don't we just legislate? And I think in ways the answer is we're talking about the non-financial reporting arena, and it's taken us over 100 years to get to some level of standardization in the financial reporting space. And interestingly, it's come not through an intergovernmental agreement, but it's come through the International Financial Reporting Standards Body, which effectively has become normative in almost every geography when it comes to reporting of your accounts. In that respect, sustainability reporting is fairly nascent. I guess GRI emerged in the very late 1990s. So we're 25 years on the journey towards, voluntarism in non-financial reporting. I do think we're almost at the point now, though, when you look at the array of reporting obligations under GRI, under the ISSB, under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU, actually there's very little that separates these. And even the attempt to sort of create this distinction of, well, we're about financial materiality, we're about some other form of outbound material, those distinctions really fall away. And so I think we could see our way towards a universal reporting standard in the same way that we've got it in the financial reporting space. Then it will be a choice of governments about the degree to which they will regulate or not. And that could come through the listing exchanges, or it could come through other mechanisms as well.
Thank you. Paul, I'm going to direct the corruption and bribery question towards you, because just the amount of European-led legislation that has come, you've got the UK Bribery and Corruption Act, you've got banking laws which are talking about know your client and businesses actually turning away. Is the financial market or the financial actors taking more active steps towards getting mining the bribery and corruption element of the natural resource sector more under control than what governments were doing or what the EITI was doing before?
I think the civil society organizations like the EITI, and there are a number of efforts to drive illicit financial flows out of mining. I think they have had an enormous impact, and I certainly take my hat off to them. I think that governments are also, in one sense, they're part of the problem, because very often they contribute to personal enrichment of people in power. And so transparency is absolutely essential. And I don't think it's an accident that the extractive industries transparency initiative has transparency at its heart, because it has to become more and more difficult for companies and governments to enter into these illicit financial arrangements. I was very encouraged. I was at a mining conference in Brazil last week, and the Brazilian Mining Association, which was organizing the conference, called IBRAM, they were very, very strong about getting illegal mining out of the Amazon. Mm-hmm. And that is a huge task, because it's tied up with organized crime. And of course, the previous administration in Brazil was encouraging illegal entry into the Amazon. And the other thing that was really encouraging was that the Mining Association was talking very, very strongly about the need to keep the Amazon forest standing. And I'd not heard that before, coming from the head, a CEO of a mining association. At the same conference, there are a whole bunch of military people, which again, I'd not seen. And these were the people who were tasked to stop illegal mining. And so there were several workshop sessions with generals and people from the military who were going out to do that. And I think that was a very interesting perspective. And if the industry is very strong on this, and if the government is strong and is prepared to utilize the powers of the state, then I think you have a chance of getting rid of this stuff. Because, I mean, as we know, it completely undermines efforts to make mining a responsible business.
No, absolutely.
So it just has to be stopped.
Yeah. And the EITI is pushing now not only the governments that signed up, but also the supporting companies. They're getting more serious about supporting companies meeting their requirements. Right. We're a few sentences away. One of the things that I was asked to do, sort of say, okay, we need to say something positive, but it can't be just hope. We need to have actions. So what I'm going to ask each panelist to say is, I think this action needs to be taken for transferring value chains into more enhanced sustainability. But it has to be a realistic action. Zenze, can we start you off?
Sure. I don't know if I can put in those words, but I'll try. One of the good things, though, is that the regulations are in place. Okay, it's part of the mining law in most of the countries, is that regulations are in place. What we are finding, though, is that there's, in most of the regulations, we're not touching on small scale mining, you know. Mm-hmm. So most of the countries are now including the artisanal small scale mining in the regulations. But for all of that to take effect, what needs to take place is the proper implementation of these regulations, and then monitoring and evaluation thereof, because that's lacking. And that will also then touch the issue of corruption and bribery as well, because if there's somebody actually watching it, and for the whole the better off of everybody else, then that will really take us further.
Okay, so regulations, including small and artisanal mining, where there are huge environmental impacts, get the regulations in, implement. Gabriella.
Yeah, from our point of view, we have to work very, very hard on water management. We have our mining is mainly in the desert or close to glaciers. So we have a problem with ice and no water. So we are working on saving water for the process, but also reusing water. Many companies right now are working on reusing the water from the tailings deposits, and many others are taking water from the sea. We are, some of them are using seawater with salt, and other ones are desalinization, the water. So water is now our biggest problem, but we are also working in improve our capacity of melting and refining copper. We are working very hard on that because right now we are sending our copper concentrate to other countries, enhancing the carbon footprint. So we are working on improve our capacity, and we are also working very hard on lithium. We have many lithium resources, so we are working in sustainable extractive lithium industry, because we now have a lithium industry. It's very basic. We just evaporate water and take lithium. So we have this real challenge today.
Okay, so using technology, water scarcity, water usage, recycling, desalinated water, and lithium as it comes up, trying to move away from the brine evaporation stage, especially since I know a number of sustainability indices actually look at a company's water consumption. So that's definitely happening as a step. Aidan, where do we go from here?
So briefly, I mean, I'm tempted to talk much more about the things that we as ICMM are very deeply involved in around tailings management, around consolidation of responsible mining standards. But on the eve of the UN conference, that's going to be talking about what governments can do. For me, the great sort of tragedy almost of the mineral sector is that minerals and metals are resources that typically states declare ownership of those resources in the interest of the wider population. And yet, consistently, I think states fail to put in basic protections at the point of entry into, of economic actors into the metals and minerals arena. And so I would encourage the governments assembled over the next 2 days to think about how can we get more serious about putting in place basic protections such that anybody who wishes to develop the mineral resources of our country can only do so if they demonstrably have a commitment to do so responsibly, if they demonstrably have the capacity to deliver on that, and if they subscribe to one of a number of internationally accepted responsible standards for mining. That, I think, would change things massively if you had that basic provision in place at the point of entry, because if you fail to get it right at the point of entry, you're into damage limitation mode thereafter.
Excellent. So for governments to consider, especially when you'll see these clauses in exploration or permitting licenses where it say company must have technical expertise without somebody clarifying what exactly is technical expertise. So governments to give serious consideration on who actually gets to exploit their lands. Inga.
Yeah, at the risk of being a little bit controversial maybe, but looking at it from the battery value chain and battery as an emerging industry and really as an enabler for the entire energy transition, I would say we probably need to focus on pressing pause or having less geopolitics and more focus on substance when it comes to what does sustainability actually mean for the product or for these value chains. Because we see this debate actually taken over. And over the last few decades or so, we were quite happy to outsource some polluting industries. Now, you know, in the geopolitical context, they have to be re-imported. But ultimately, we need to look at it as our, you know, in the context of the planetary boundary and as the global footprint of the industry, because you'll never have a sort of end-to-end battery value chain in every country, right? So ultimately, the costs and the benefits of this industry, of the green transition, need to be borne collectively. So that's what the conversation should be focusing on. Yeah, that would be sort of my plea, I suppose, to the delegates.
It's an interesting division of labor. Let the industry figure out what the technical stuff is, and the geopolitics allow trade and connections and etc. to help that industry flourish. And I'm not going to go into the geopolitics because I want to get into serious trouble there. Teodorico, what would you want to see? What would make your life easier?
I think what of course really make the for example some of the developing countries to be life easier is the of course the identifications of opportunities for enhanced international cooperations, in particular, for example, the needed transitions, the needed critical minerals on the green transitions. So I think there should be a cooperations that, of course, with respect to the needed technology and capacity building, of course, of a developing countries. That, as I've said earlier, that been mentioned earlier, that it is important to balance, of course, the needed export, and of course, the needed export, the minerals needed by the, of course, by developed countries. But of course, it should always be looked upon that some developing countries which have these mineral resources don't have the technology, and of course, it is important for these countries to have the value adding, of course, and of course, even to the development of downstream industries. And I just want to, of course, to add that having a sound mining law is, of course, is good, but there is also need for fostering capacity building, and then on the technical and scientific cooperations in the mining sector. For example, on the environmental protections. Some of the developing countries, for example, need the state-of-the-art technology to prevent environmental disaster, like, for example, the failure in tailings storage facilities. And of course, for example, in the small-scale mining, the needed, of course, technical assistance also by the small-scale miners with respect to sound, nearly sound engineering design, for example, on their tailing storage. So I think that is really international cooperation is really important. So that, of course, the needed good way of life by the, of course, by the people will be addressed.
So equitable share in technology, capacities, and engineering. And just a note of equitable share does not mean charity. That this is a business proposition. It makes profit. It makes sense, economic sense. So just have equitable shares. Paul, what would need to happen so when you can finally say, I don't need to write any more books after this?
Well, yes, I'm not going to hope that happens, obviously, but if you'll forgive me, I'm going to answer from a European perspective, because that's where I come from. I think the European Union, particularly because of its size, the UK probably has a role to play in this as well, but obviously the EU is a much larger market. I think it has a wonderful opportunity to put into practice this mutually beneficial relationship between the four parties that we're talking about: the host country governments, the host country communities, the companies, and the importing countries. Our countries have a huge mining history. We have huge relationships. Many of the largest mining companies come from Europe. And I think with the Critical Raw Materials Act at the EU level, there is a real opportunity to build the trust that unfortunately is not really there at the moment. And I can understand why it isn't necessarily there, but there is a real opportunity to do that, provided the European negotiators and the governments are in good faith. And I think that is what they need to prove.
Trust and faith, absolutely, in so many things. My final question for Khadija: what one action would she like to see that would spur sustainability?
Pour conclure, quelle action, une action qui pourrait aider à s'assurer de la durabilité du secteur?
Merci beaucoup. Moi, je pense que les actions, il y en a plusieurs, hein, il y a plusieurs actions. Et je pense que la première action, il faut veiller au renforcement du cadre juridique parce que c'est la base. Parce qu'il faudra quand même qu'on ait des législations fortes qui posent des exigences à des entreprises minières. C'est la base. Et comme autre action que je peux identifier, c'est le renforcement de la coopération internationale et régionale dans certains secteurs, dans certains sous-secteurs dans certains sous-secteurs de l'activité minière. C'est important dans la mesure où c'est cette coopération qui va permettre à certains États qui ne disposent pas d'assez d'expérience ou bien d'assez de mécanismes pour pouvoir quand même s'inspirer de ce que font les autres en matière de durabilité environnementale dans le secteur minier. Comme autre action également, il y a la recherche scientifique, c'est important parce qu'il y a plusieurs thématiques ou bien plusieurs sous-secteurs dans le secteur minier qui ne trouvent pas encore, pour lesquels on n'a pas encore trouvé de solution. Et je pense que la communauté internationale doit se mobiliser à cette recherche scientifique pour proposer des solutions dans certains domaines tels que la gestion des résidus miniers, par exemple, qui pose extrêmement problème. Et je pense que les États partagent ces difficultés. Et moi, je pense que, pour résumer, il y a le renforcement de la législation, la recherche scientifique, la coopération internationale.
So Khalida mentioned three actions. The first one was about strengthening the legal system. And the second one was the reinforcement of cooperation, local and regional cooperation, which is important, as some regions don't have the experience needed to address the problem. And then the third action is about scientific knowledge. There is a need to have a global scientific knowledge on this topic, as various member states do share the same difficulties.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got two tasks left. First of all, a hand for the panel. Second of all, a hand for yourselves for staying here until 6:15 and getting this done. Thank you. Right, I believe alcohol is on offer. Manuela, where are we going? I think we're done. We can officially get up, have some food, have some drinks, enjoy the music, a little bit of dancing for those who are still up for it. And I wish you guys a very good next 2 days for who are staying here and doing more of this work. Thank you. Thank you.